tabbies, at least some of them. And I kind of thought about it, and with your permission, I'd like to, instead of kind of rushing forward into the children, I'd like to take a little bit more time with Yitzchak and Rivka, and then to do Yaakov and Rachel, and then actually to look at Moshe and Tzipporah, which, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that in a way that Moshe and Tzipporah is kind of a Yaakov and Rachel do-over with a much happier ending, which is, well, kind of a happy, maybe. Okay. Anyway, so all right. So we're going to start. We left off last week where Yitzchak and Rivka met each other, and Rivka fell off of her camel, and we talked about how these two people are coming from radically different places. Pretty much every conceivable difference between two people, you've got it. You've got an age difference, you've got a geographical difference, you've got a cultural difference, you've got religious difference, you've got family values different, you've got the only difference is that they're both coming from economically wealthy families, but Abraham is a shepherd, Bethuel, Lavan are definitely business type people. So you've got, as opposed to Avram and Sarah, where we established that these were, the age difference was not so big, it was 9 years, and they're coming from the same place, and obviously the same family, and the same value system. Yitzchak and Rivka is a model of marriage where you're dealing with about as opposites as you get. And we also know that the communication styles were very different. Rivka, we see already from her interaction with Eliezer, is a much more, she's forthcoming, she's assertive, like, yeah, sure, I'll go with her. And then she says to Eliezer, who's the guy? And she falls off her camel. And Yitzchak is kind of like, his head is perpetually in the clouds. And just in case we had any doubts, so now I want to go to the beginning of Parshat Toldot, which is Perek Kaf Hey, chapter 25, Pasuk Kaf, verse 20. Okay? So Ve'ela Toldot Yitzchak ben Abraham. Okay? These are the generations, or these are the offspring events. That's a whole other discussion about what the word Toldot means. But in any case, these are the generations of Yitzchak ben Abraham. Abraham holidet Yitzchak. And there's lots and lots and lots of parshanut about that pasuk, but for our purposes, because we're focusing on Yitzchak as Rivka's spouse, that's pretty much everything you need to know about Yitzchak. Right? That Yitzchak is Abraham's child, and that Abraham gave birth, and the whole story behind those words, Abraham holidet Yitzchak, there's a huge geschicht behind those words. So Abraham gave birth to Yitzchak. Vayhi Yitzchak ben 40 shana, and Yitzchak was 40, which is probably of the Avot, and certainly of the Avot, and Moshe is certainly of the Avot, he's the youngest to get married. Yaakov was 65. Abraham, we don't know how old he was, but he's young. Bekachto et Rivka, and look at how Rivka is described. Rivka bat Bethuel ha'arami mi padan aram achot Lavan ha'arami. Lots more description here, and this description is really important. So Rivka, first of all, is the daughter of Bethuel, the merchant, the rich guy, from Aram, and we know how loaded that word has become in our literature, right? Arami Oved Aviv from the Pesach Seder. He is from Aram, and again, talking about a geographical difference. Aram is on the sea. It's very cosmopolitan. It's flatter. It's more temperate. It's rainy. There are trees and leaves and seasons, as opposed to the Judean desert, which is pretty monochromatic and monoseasonable. Although my son called me yesterday and said, "Guess what, Mom? It's raining." I said, "What?" He said, "It's raining, there's thunder, there's lightning. But don't worry, the weathermen say it's okay for it to rain this late." I'm like, okay, good. Only from the Gush do you get a religious weather report. Okay. So he's from Aram, and specifically Mi Padan Aram. And Padan Aram was Padan of Aram. It was the place where the rivers, Padan is an Akkadian word meaning the place where the rivers meet. It's kind of where the Tigris and the Euphrates finally meet up on their way to the Mediterranean. Like, this is a major, Padan Aram is a major metropolitan center in the ancient world. Okay. In addition, she's also the sister of Laban, also the Arami. We know about Laban from later. So she's coming from a very big difference. Okay. Fast forward now. No, I'm sorry, not fast forward. And then we continue here. Vaye'atar Yitzchak laHashem lenochach ishto ki akara hi. Vaye'atar lo Hashem batahi l'Rivka. Batahar Rivka ishto. What I find fascinating about this pasuk is it says, again, in very, very few words, and in words that we don't really think about what they're saying about the nature of the system here. There are basically two people who are married. Each person is coming from a family, right? Yitzchak is coming from Abraham. By the way, it doesn't say anything about Sarah here, which I find fascinating. Rivka is coming from her, not only from her father, but from her brother and from her city. Okay? And then it says, and Yitzchak David, or Yitzchak implored, that's really what Vaye'atar means. Yitzchak implored to Hashem in front of his wife, Ki Akara, because she is barren. And Rashi here, and this is a Rashi that I always have had trouble with, being both a Chozeret B'Teshuvah and as somebody for whom it took 9 years for my husband and I to have children. I always had trouble with this Rashi, right? Famous Rashi here. Why does Hashem, they're both davening. Why does Hashem listen to Yitzchak? Because he's a tzaddik ben tzaddik instead of a tzaddik ben Rasha. Okay? But stepping away from the kind of more surface level of what that Mishnah, what the Midrash is saying, let's look at what this says about the nature of the relationship. So first of all, Yitzchak is standing in front of, or actually facing his wife. Let's go back to Bereshit. E'eselo ezer kenegdo. The relationship between Yitzchak and Rivka is just that. They are ezer kenegdo. They are facing each other. Even though you would think that two people who are so opposite are going to be at cross purposes with each other, as opposed to Abram and Sarah, who you kind of imagine as side by side, almost in going back to that kind of Adam 1 relationship. They're both on a mission, they have the same mission. You have these two individuals who are coming from such different places, but they are nochach, one to the other, right? Shifti Beit Hashem Kol Yemei Chayai Nochach, right? I'm really bad at spouting these psukim, but you get the general point, right? That's how we see ourselves, that we are nochach, that we are facing, not just facing physically, but unified in purposes. So he is facing his wife. She knows that he is davening for her. Whether she's davening or not depends on how you read that particular midrash. And Lefi Pshuto, Hashem answers Yitzchak because Yitzchak is the one who davens. If you go deeper into the midrash, Hashem answers Yitzchak because Yitzchak has a leg up. I mean, it's just that simple. It's not, not only as I got older, I came to realize not only is it not an insult to Rivka, but to say that somebody who's coming from such a quote-unquote disadvantaged type of background, to be able to be facing one-on-one to Yitzchak is really something quite remarkable, right? You're taking the daughter of the Wolf of Wall Street, okay, and marrying her effectively to the Dalai Lama. Like, that's what we're talking about here. And, right, that's kind of, if the Dalai Lama were to have gotten married, which he didn't, but you get the idea. It's a pretty remarkable thing that somebody who grows up the child of the Wolf of Wall Street can be on an equal footing, and they are, and they're both also on an equal footing in terms of Hashem's presence, and we see this in the following psukim, when it says, that Vayitro Tzitzu Habanim B'Kirba, and the children she got pregnant with twins, and the children were battling it out in her womb. Vatomer Im Kain Lama Anochi, if this is what's going to happen, why have I been here? Meaning, like, if I'm carrying these twins and they're already giving me this trouble and I'm going to die in childbirth, like, what's the point? But Telach Lidrosh et Hashem. And she goes to seek out Hashem. And again, Lefi HaMidrash, right? She goes to the yeshiva of Shem V'Ever, do with that Midrash what you will, but clearly she's going somewhere to some religious authority to seek out God. Vayomer Hashem Allah. So while on the one hand, she is Rivka bat Betuel Achot Lavan, on the one hand, she is Tzaddik ben Rasha, and while on the one hand Hashem answers Yitzchak, on the other hand, she has just as much right to go seek out God. And God talks to her. Like, she is, bam, Vatomer la Hashem. She is a Niviyah. There's no question. So even though, and I think what it's trying to tell us here is that even though you have two people who are coming together with such different backgrounds, at a certain point in a marriage, you leave the background at the door. And now it's about the two of you and your relationship to each other and your relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and how those three pieces of the triangle come together. And we know from last week that, he loved her and he found her, even though she was so different, to be really, in many ways, stepping into his mother's footsteps. So,
Mrs. Herzog?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I only called because you said you
Thank you. I
Okay.
appreciate that. Yeah. For those of you who haven't been here yet, I have no peripheral vision. So if you want my attention, please just call my name, because otherwise I might not see you. Yes.
Thank you. Don't you think when we're looking at this face-to-face and Rivka's sort of unusually equal role, that we have to really say Yitzchak always needs somebody to tell him what to do, otherwise he's
Lost. Yes. Very much so.
Although nobody tells him to daven for her, as opposed to Rachel, who asks
Right. And we're going to get to that.
for that
Yes.
or demands, and he seems to take initiative, which really works out well here.
But it's
And
rare,
different than
isn't it?
Abraham too.
Right.
Isn't
What's-
it rare that he takes initiative?
I think when it comes to a relationship with Hashem, and we'll see this in the very next thing that we're going to look for, I think for him to initiate his contact with God is second nature. Where he's lacking, and I think this is what you're picking up on, is in his person to person. And that's in effect, that's Yitzchak. Yitzchak he's about as close to a saint as Judaism gets. He really has one foot in this world, but one foot, or his head and his eyes and his in a way, his perspective very much in Hashem's world, which is why it's hard for him, impossible for him to really see who Esav is. Okay, so yes, you are correct. And also he allows it. Going back to what we finished with last week, right? After the whole Yaakov Esav thing, he doesn't reproach her. He accepts what she's bringing to the table. So he not only, he clearly recognizes that she is radically different from him, but he accepts the strengths that she brings to that and embraces it, which is, again, like you said, very different from, we're going to look at Yaakov and Rachel. Okay, so let's fast forward to chapter 26, to Perikav Vav, and we have a similar situation to we had with Abraham, right? There's a famine, except there are two critical differences here. Difference number one is Hashem tells Yitzchak to go. Again, the relationship between Yitzchak and Hashem is quite close. And the second thing is if we look carefully and we look in Pasuk Zayin, it says, "Vayishalu anshe hamakom leishto, vayomer achotihi." That when the people of Gerar asked him about this woman, then he said, "She is my wife." It is a reactive statement rather than a proactive statement. I'm sorry, she's my sister. Thank you. She's my sister. Okay. Ki arei lemor, because he was afraid to say, "Ishti she's my wife." Penya hageni anshe hamakom al Rivka ki tovat mar'eh he. Okay, it's a slightly different description, but I believe that the difference here is significant, right? With Abraham and Sarah, he says, "Hinena yadati ki isha ifa mareh, ado tovat mareh." Right? I am now aware of it. Like up until this point, it wasn't really relevant. Please lie for me. Here, what we have is a situation where he doesn't comment to her on her physical beauty. The text does. Okay, that's point number 2. And point number 1 is he doesn't ask her to lie. He doesn't even preemptively lie. He says, okay, let's see how this plays itself out, and I'm going to lie if I have to. Right? And again, hang on 1 second, Suzanne. Again, we see, and I believe that this is setting up a stark contrast between Yitzchak and Betuel/Lavan. Is Betuel/Lavan, they are opportunists, liars. They'll lie whether they have to or not. Abraham will lie if he has to. Yitzchak doesn't even think of lying until it's presented, like, to his face, so to speak. And then he will to protect his wife. Suzanne?
It sort of bothers me that the Torah is condoning lying under certain circumstances, because it's really not a value that we're trying to teach our children.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we reconcile that? I mean, basically it's saying it's okay to lie in certain circumstances, and yet that's not really our value. Or
So
maybe
I was
it
going to
is.
say, so the simple answer is that this is pikuach nefesh, that we know that when a human life is involved, basically all bets are off. You can pretty much do anything and everything that's necessary. Lie, cheat, steal, break Shabbos, break kashrus, do whatever you need to do short of adultery, idolatry, and murder to save another human life. That's point number 1. The other thing I will say too is like what Aviva Zorenberg said many years ago when she taught about Yaakov and Yosef, is that yes, this is a phenomenon. Sometimes the avot lie. Number 1, I'm pretty much quoting her, you have to be an Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yosef to know when it's okay to lie. Which, you can take or leave that point. But the second point, and this is the one that really stuck with me, is lies have their consequences. So maybe it's okay to lie. But every lie that's told in Bereshit comes back to bite multiple times, right? So when Abraham tells the lie, it comes back to bite. Yitzchak tells the lie, we're going to see like in the next pasuk, it comes back to bite. Yaakov lies, it comes back to bite many, many, many times. Yosef, the only reason probably his lie doesn't bite is because by the time it could come back to bite, everybody's dead. And also because because his lie in a way is a response to a travesty that was perpetuated on him. So lying in a way is like the least of all evils. Like he could have had his brothers assassinated and nobody would have given a hoot or cared. So you're absolutely correct. There are lies, but it's like polygamy. It's not a happy ending. Okay? All right, and so we see that he says she's my sister, and then in the very, very next verse, right, in Pasuk Chet, Vayhi ki archu lo sham, he was there for a long time, Vayashkev Avimelech Melech Plishtim, and Avimelech looked out of his window, be'ad hachalon, Vayar v'hinei Yitzchak mitzachek et Rivka ishto. Okay, and lest we, minimize the translation, and he saw Yitzchak making sport. That's literally what it means, making sport, or in the language of the old days, making whoopee, with Rivka. And by the way, this is one of the sources for the halacha that when the halachot talk about when is it appropriate and acceptable for a man and a woman to be intimate, and when is it not acceptable and appropriate for a man and a woman to be intimate. Like the first rule is it has to be either at a time and or a place where other people can't see, right? So this is where the idea of it being at night, but then later Chachamim come along and talk about, well, if it's in a room that's high enough, or if there's a curtain, or if the walls are thick enough, like this idea of when you're doing something personal and intimate, it needs to be somewhere where it's not visible to the general public, not only for purposes of modesty, but for political safety, right? Because the next thing we know, Avimelech hauls Yitzchak into his palace. This is the king we're talking about, okay? Avimelech, you lied to me, and he did. You lied to me, and he says, "Vayhi," and in the next pasuk, he says, "Vayikra Avimelech leYitzchak vayomer," and he calls to Yitzchak and he says, "Ach hine ishtecha, she's your wife. How did you tell me that she was your sister?" And he says to him, because I thought, the people, they're not really very high morals of this place, etc. And then Avimelech continues, "Vayomer Avimelech, mazot asita lanu, what did you do to us? Kimat shachab ota acher." Somebody almost slept with your wife, and vehevita aleinu asham, and you're, something really bad is going to happen if one of us would have slept with Yitzchak's wife. And this kind of begins and continues this whole negative relationship between Abraham and Yitzchak, and Plishtim and the wells, and closing the wells, and opening the wells, and digging the wells, and that bad blood exists 3,500 years later. Like that hasn't improved much. But again, it's really, really clear that Yitzchak and Rivka's relationship, and again, despite being so opposite, was one, again, which was almost Edenic, going back to that Gan Eden, that Ezer Kenegdo, and Davak Be'ishto, and V'hayu L'Sachad, that there was a deep spiritual connection, and then there was also a deep physical connection between the two of them. And this is after the boys were born. Let's remember that. Yitzchak was 65 when the boy, I think, right? Something like that. It was a long time before the boys were born. So they're older already. Do with that information what you will. Okay. Let's fast forward to Parakuf Tet, chapter 29. Okay? Yaakov and Rachel, the tragic love story of the Bible. Okay? So I always tell my students, they're like, oh, the Torah doesn't talk about falling in love, and it's all about economics and contracts. I'm like, yeah, because let's look at the one or two situations where falling in love is involved, and they don't end too happily. Okay? Yaakov and Rachel is a love story. Michal and David is a love story. These stories, neither one of which end particularly happily, and it goes back to Bereshit, to Gan Eden, Elecha tsheshukatech v'hu yimshol, that when there is this emotional need that is imbalanced between one and the other, that imbalance, like anything that is imbalanced, is set up a situation where the chance of bad happening is greater because you're missing balance. What Avram and Sarah had was balance. What Yitzchak and Rivka had was balance, even though on the surface, particularly Yitzchak and Rivka, seemed very unbalanced. What Yaakov did not have with his wives was balance, and this has eternal repercussions. Rabbi Alex Israel, who just, I'll plug his book, put out a book on Malachim. I'll plug him because he's a super nice guy, and he's really smart, and he writes in a way that normal people can actually read. In his book on Sefer Malachim, and when he came to talk to our girls at the beginning of this year, talks about that, is that basically from the time of Yaakov and his wives, there's been a rivalry and an imbalance in Judaism, and it's almost like in our DNA, this tension, whether it's between rich and poor, and Ashkenaz and Sfard, and East and West, and America and Israel, whatever it is, religious, not religious, that there's always this bifurcation, and that our national goal, and particularly, if you look in the Nevi'im is to go back to that, kind of wind the clock back, Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David, that the idea is to kind of bring that back to the point of unification rather than division. So, famous love story, Yaakov runs away from home. We're in Pasuk Kaftet, Perek Kaftet. He runs away from home, and Hashem comes to him in a dream and says, don't worry, you'll be fine. And he continues on his way, and he gets to Haran and gets to the well. Okay, so we're gonna Vayomer Lahem. I'm in Pasuk Hey in Perek Kaftet. Okay, Vayomer Lahem. Hayidatem et Lavan ben Nahor. Do you know Lavan ben Nahor? And they say, yeah, we know. Vayomer Lahem Hashalom Lo. And how is he? And they say, Shalom. He's fine. This is they're not particularly forthcoming. And I always talk with my students: are they being rude? Are they being xenophobic? Or do they not like Lavan? V'hinei Rachel bito ba'a imatzon. And Rachel is showing up with the sheep. And then he has this conversation with them, which we're going to skip. And then we're going to go to Pasuk Tet, I think it is. And he sees Rachel. Okay, Odena midabrim imam, they're still talking. V'Rachel ba'a imatzon. Pasuk Tet, asher la'aviyah ki ro'ah, because she's a shepherd. Vayhi ka'asher ra'ah, Yaakov et Rachel bat Lavan achi imo, ve'et hatzon. So he sees Rachel, and he rushes over to the stone with a burst of adrenaline. Leonardo DiCaprio, slow the music, you can imagine the cinematic thing, and he pushes that stone out of the way, right? He picks up the Volkswagen, saves the baby. Woohoo! Okay, can we please remember this is a 65-year-old man? Okay, I always remind my students, you have to do the math. Yaakov is 65 when this happens. Pretty wacky. And he sees Rachel, so clearly something really deep, profound, physical, emotional. It's like that big moment happens, and he rolls the stone, okay, and he gives this, and then he kisses her, and he cries, okay, and so from the get-go, Yaakov's relationship to Rachel is one that is founded on emotion. Like, this is all raw emotion. He's far from home, he misses his family, he is a fugitive, he knows his brother's doesn't know if his brother's going to come after him to kill him. Like, he's just had this vision from God, and the ladder and the angels and the promise, like he's an emotional whirlwind, and that's the basis of the relationship. It's emotions, it's adrenaline, it's moving the stone, it's hugs and kisses, it's crying, okay, and then Yaakov says what happened, etc., 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 and he meets Lavan, his future father-in-law, and then it says that he's the one who, even as opposed to Yitzhak, who doesn't love his wife until after he marries her. Yaakov loves Rachel from the get-go, right? And we see that in Pasuk. It describes Rachel and Leah in verses Tet Vav and Tet Zayin, right? One was older, one was younger, one was beautiful, one had unique eyes. That's a whole different story, okay? And then it says straight out. Says Vayehav Yaakov et Rachel, and he loved Rachel. That's it.
Why?
We don't know. We don't know. It's an emotional response.
Saw her with the stone and.
That's it. Boom. That chick with the sheep, Ladies, go out, make a sheep perfume. I don't know. I don't know. I really, and I think that's part of the point here is we don't know. We don't know why Yaakov fell in love with Rachel. We don't even know if Rachel fell in love with Yaakov. Okay? And you can read these psukim about Rachel and Leah in so many different ways. Like, as children, we think that Rachel, is the blonde, because it's always blonde, is the blonde Cinderella, and Leah is the ugly stepsister. But that's, if you look in the Mefarshim, that's far from the truth. First of all, there's a midrash that says that Leah and Rachel were identical twins. Hence, the midnight mix-up. And the only difference between Rachel and Leah was that Leah had different looking eyes, and that those eyes were so different that it kind of drew all the attention. So Rachel basically looked more perfect. But other than that, there's another explanation that says that Leah she's called the Gidolah, right? She's called the older one. But Gidolah doesn't just mean older, but she's in fact the better one. She's the one who goes through what she does to marry Yaakov, according to the Midrash, because she doesn't want to marry a Russia. Right? That's the whole thing with the crying and with the going along with the switching, and it's like so. And she's, Rachel is the one who's kind of snippy, that we see in later dialogue. So, I always tell my students, get this image of the fairy princess and the ogress out of your head. This is not the case. What's really simple is that love is blind, and I don't use that phrase unintentionally, right? Yitzchak is blinded by his love for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yaakov is blinded by his love for Rachel. And these are the results of what happens when love is blind. Is these the consequences of that? And he works for her for 7 years, and it says straight out, they seem like a few days because of his great love for her. I mean, this is just Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare was not so original.
I'm just picking up, I don't know if you mean it, that in a way Rachel didn't deserve to be the preferred one. She was a little snippy, but love was blind, so she was. Almost as if Leah might have been.
And the Midrash bears this out a little bit later when she gives up her night with Yaakov for Leah. Like, we think that's so magnanimous and generous. We're going to look at that. Number one, it's not. It's a deal. It's a trade. And number two, the Midrash comes along and says, and that's why she's not buried in Marat HaMachpelah, because she gave up a night with a tzaddik. And so then she is punished, so to speak, for eternity. Now, the flip side is the other midrash with, Rachel mebaka al baneha, that it is only Rachel that convinces God to not wipe out the Jews totally at the time of Churban by Rishon. And it is in Rachel's zechut that Hashem says, V'shavu banim l'gvulam, and that's why she's buried on the way out of Yerushalayim. Like, these are not black and white characters. There are no villains and saints. Everybody's complicated. And certainly one of my goals, and my freshmen know this, and I think in general it's a goal of the Tanakh department here, is like, we want to view these people as people, because otherwise we can't relate to them. And even with them being people, she's still Rachel Imenu. This is still Yaakov Avinu. Even with their flaws, they kind of overcame their flaws, which is, at least to me, very inspiring, because it doesn't give me any excuses. And if, they can overcome their flaws, then we can overcome ours. And he's still Yaakov, and she's still Rachel, even with her snippiness and his blind devotion to her. It's a pretty remarkable thing to think about. So in any case, he's in love with her. Yaakov, falls for the Leah. And then here's another example, depending on which midrashim and which mefarshim you look at, we all know the midrash where Rachel gives the signs to Leah. It's not so simple, and according to the Ramban, Yaakov was furious with Leah for tricking him. In other words, when he says, when he gets up the next morning and he goes to Lavan, he says, why did you do this? It's not so clear who he's talking to. Is he talking to Lavan? Is he talking to Leah? Like, okay, if you want to say that you were forced by your father and you didn't want to make a public spectacle and you didn't want to disobey your father and you didn't want to be humiliated, that's fine. But once we were in our tent and that candle was blown out, you didn't have to go through with this. If you were really honest, you can kind of imagine this conversation that happens, right? If you were honest with me, and she's like, but I wanted to marry you. But if you were honest with me, but I wanted to marry you. So it seems like, talk about a love triangle. Yaakov is in love with Rachel, Leah is in love with Yaakov. And the two sisters want what they can't have. right? She wants children, she wants her husband to love her. It's very painful, and it's very much the human condition that what's going on here is what happens when we don't get what we want, and then we make decisions based on that, and they have repercussions. So when we look at it in terms of a system, we see in a way that Leah is more the Yitzchak type, right? I'm sorry, Leah is more the Yaakov type, and Rachel is in many ways much more passive. Like, Leah will do what she needs to get done, and then we see later with the story with the Dudaim, with the mandrakes, the fertility drugs, right, when Reuven comes home, and this is a whole different story, and we'll talk about it when children get involved, and Rachel says, can I have those mandrakes? And Leah's sister, like, hello, you took my husband's love, and now you want my mandrakes? And my students are very quick to point out, Rachel didn't take anything. Yaakov gave. But again, this is what happens in this system is Leah, feels that she's been robbed of something that's not hers. I mean, you know how you react when you feel that you're robbed of something that, it's like you're going to hold it that much tighter. And I think that what happens in this family is they don't do what Yitzchak and Rivka did. And we see this in the one written conversation that we have between Rachel and Yaakov, and that's in Perek Lamed and Pasuk, I think it's Pasuk Bet. It's Pasuk Aleph, I'm sorry, verse 1. Vateri Rachel kilo yalda leYaakov, right? So she sees that she has not given birth to children to Yaakov. Vatikane Rachel ba'achota, and she's jealous of her sister, okay? Because she realizes something must be wrong with her, right? Fertility is not Yaakov's problem. Leah's just popped out 4 children. Vatomer el Yaakov, and she says to Yaakov, Hava li banim, give me children. V'im ayin meta anochi, and if not, I'm going to die, or I'm dead. Okay? Vayichar af Yaakov v'Rachel. Only time we have this, where we have anger in a relationship between husband and wife in Sefer Breshit. Vatomer, hatachat ha'Elohim anochi? Am I in place of God? Asher mana mimcha pribetim, that he has, he lays it on the line, that he's the one who is withholding fruits of the womb. Okay? So he yells at her. And the Ramban here says something very poignant, and the Ramban points out is that Yaakov feels, no, not Yaakov feels, Rachel is purposely playing with Yaakov's emotions. Because she knows that he loves her. And she knows that if she says, I'm going to kill myself, or I feel like I'm dead, or I'm better off dead, that this is going to pull at his heartstrings. So she knows she's manipulating him. He knows that she's manipulating him, and that's why he gets angry. He's not angry at her because she's barren. He's angry at her because she's being manipulative. And that's the hallmark of his father. It's like, no. Lavan has no place in this marriage, right? My mother was Lavan's sister, Bethuel's daughter. She managed to distance herself. There is no place for duplicitousness. Ironic for Yaakov to be saying there's no place for duplicitousness, but again, this is the system, right? He's trying to establish a marriage 5 years into it, but he's trying to establish a marriage that mirrors the marriage of his parents. That's what we do, is that on the one hand, we marry our opposite parent spouse. On the other hand, for better and for worse, we try to imitate the relationship that our parents had. Harriet Lerner, a psychologist, talks about relationships, both marriage and otherwise, as dances, and she talks about them as being very tightly choreographed, and that we choose partners and we choose steps that we are familiar with. So we choose a spouse that is similar to our parent, and we unconsciously orchestrate a relationship that looks like the relationship that our parents had, for better and for worse. And that, the the goal is to make the unconscious conscious, and if there's a negative choreography, to try and change those steps. And this is what Yaakov is doing. He's like, no. We are not having a love on lying, duplicitous, manipulative relationship here. This is, I'm telling you, I am not God. You have to take action. This is on you. You're the one with the fertility problems, not me. And what's interesting is that she listens. She listens. She gets the message. She listens. So there's a fight and it's over. So at least they fight healthy. So, because it says, Vatomer, Hine amati bilha, ba'elaha. Right? Here's my maidservant. She takes a page from Sarah's book. I can't have children. You're right. So take the child. Take my maidservant, okay, and have a child with her. Vateled, and then she should give birth, I'll be okay, like instead of me. Ve'ibanami man, gam anochi, and I will also. In other words, I'm willing to share. Maybe I'm not willing to share my sister, but I'm willing to share my maidservant. And then Bilha, Vatahar Bilha, she gets pregnant. Vateled li Yaakov ben, she has a son. Vatomer Rachel, and it's Rachel who names her. Danani Elokim v'gam shama b'koli v'yitain li ben. That's why she calls him Dan. Danani Elokim v'gam shama b'koli. Hashem judged me, found me wanting, obviously, but then he listened to my voice. Once I turned to him, remember that Yaakov and Yitzchak and Rivka, once I turned to Hashem, once I did my part, then I get rewarded. And this is the only conversation, we actually hear between Yaakov and Rachel. Yes?
This whole concept of Ibaneh from my maidservant.
Right.
I don't totally get. So your husband now sleeps with somebody else.
Right.
That child becomes your child and Bilha backs off and isn't mothering that child anymore?
Okay.
Or just like who's bringing,
Okay, so this is...
I know she names him, but then what?
So this is not a new concept. This is, Hammurabi
Wow.
talks about this. So the way I understand this concept is as follows, and we know that in China, the Chinese concubines is a very similar type of idea, is that the Bilha belongs to Rachel. She is Rachel's property. Therefore, any progeny that comes from her is entitled to whatever benefits Rachel has. So that child is Yaakov's child, plus that child gets Rachel's protection in the sense that he or she can't just be sold off to slavery. Bilha, as a Pilegesh of Yaakov now, has conjugal rights with Yaakov and actually has a greater degree of protection from Yaakov than she does just as if she were just to be Rachel's maidservant. So it's actually this arrangement protects Bilha more than it exposes her. And from the way I've always understood it, it's kind of like a what's it called, sister house, the thing about the Mormons, right? It's that kind of a setup. So that and we know this from the Midrashim, the children, everybody knows who is whose mother. And certainly Leah's children don't let Bilha and Zilpah's children forget it. But on the other hand, everybody is kind of raising everybody. It's an extended clan.
When you say they have conjugal rights, I would think if you're my property, I want to get a child out of you, then get my child and then stay away from my husband. Why? You're my property. I could just say, okay, you slept with him, the baby got made, don't sleep with him anymore.
Because now that she is Yaakov's Pilegesh, she has rights too. And we know that she is now Yaakov's Pilegesh because when Reuven sleeps with her, or not, depending on how you read it, Bilha is referred to as Pilegesh Aviv.
So that's a status, Pilegesh. By having a child with him, she now became something other than just a person who had a child with him. She became
it's a
Pelegish.
right, which means that she
Has
now
rules.
has her own rights.
She has her own rights.
In other words, as Rachel's maidservant, she basically doesn't have rights. As Yaakov's Pelegish, she does. So it's Rachel is willing, in effect, to give Bilhah conjugal and legal rights and status in exchange for her being able to say, this is my son.
Even though we think of Rachel basically as Yosef and Benjamin's mother more than anything else.
Right. Right. And the reason we think of Rachel as Yosef and Benjamin's mother is because we know darn well that the brothers don't let each other forget whose mother is whose. In other words, best laid plans. Yeah, it's complicated.
Hard family.
Complicated. That's what I say. Polygamy, mutter, doesn't work out too well. One man, one woman. There's a reason for this system. Okay. I just want to wrap up with Moshe and his wife, which is a very different kind of a story. It's similar, yet different somehow. So we're in Shemot. We're in Perek Bet, chapter 2. And I ran out of time and stickies. Okay. So Moshe runs away, right? I'm sorry, it's the end of Perek Aleph, I think. He runs away. And
What's the end of 2?
it is the end of 2. Thank you. This is why I need my stickies. Okay, here we go. We are in verse 16. Pasuk Tet. Okay, so he gets to Midian and he sits by the well. Masa, he knows, good meeting ground. And this is, and the Kohen of Midian had 7 daughters, and they come and also to the well, like Yaakov and Rivka and Yitzchak, Eliezer, Rivka, the whole 9 yards, right? And they come and they draw the water, they fill up the troughs, and to water the stone of the sheep of their father. Vayavo ha'ra'im, and the male shepherds come along and they chase them away. Vayakam Moshe vayoshi'an, and Moshe steps up and he saves them. Vayashk etzona, and he waters their sheep. Vatavona, and they come home, we know the story, they come home to Reuel, Yitro, whoever. Vayomer, madua mihartem, how'd you get home so fast? Normally it takes you a long time. Vatomarna ish mitzri hitzilenu, an Egyptian saved us, miyad haroim, tells us that this was kind of a common occurrence. The gam, and also he, pulled up that bucket, and he gave our son to drink. So, on the one hand, this is identical to Yaakov and Rachel, in that you've got a man, a woman, sheep, well, ro'im, just like there were ro'im there. Where it's different is twofold. Number one, love has nothing to do with it. Okay, what's love got to do with it? In this case, nothing. It had nothing to do with love. Moshe's actions had to do with justice. Moshe's actions didn't have to do with God, didn't have to do with God's mission, didn't have to do with being in love, didn't have to do with following what his father wanted. It had to do with the thing that motivates Moshe from the get-go, and that is justice. What motivates Moshe at this point more than anything else is equal rights, is human decency. The Ramban spells it out. He was infuriated because these shepherds, not only were they being obnoxious, but they were stealing. These women had taken, and I don't know if any of you has ever drawn water out of a well. I did it once at one of these, I don't remember where it was, but it is hard work. It's really hard work. And sheep and goats drink a lot of water, and it's a lot of buckets. And remember, this is a desert, and it's hot. So you're drawing water, you're trying to make sure not to spill a single drop because water is precious, and then these brutes come along and they're like, yeah, right, you're not going to give those sheep that water, are you, right? You're going to just back away. And they're, no, we're not going to back. And then it's vayigarshum. That's a pretty strong word. They chase them away. So the relationship begins with justice. That's point number one, as opposed to love. And the other thing is that as opposed to the villainous father-in-law, namely Laban, here we have an equally righteous, moral, justice-minded father-in-law named Yitro. And the irony strikes me often that here is Lavan, who is Nahor's grandson, right? He is Yitzchak's first cousin. Don't even try to do this family tree because it gets really confusing. But Lavan and Yitzchak are first cousins. And look at Lavan. Yitro comes from Midian. He's like middle of nowhere. He's not even a Semite, right? He's I think a Yaphetite. You would think that he doesn't have any core values that have anything similar to us, and yet his core values are totally similar to ours, which is probably why the Gemara says that Yitro knew all of the religions, and he chose monotheism, and eventually he converted. So we have the very benign, kind father-in-law, and he says, hi, why didn't you invite this guy home for dinner? Like, hello, let's show some Bedouin hospitality here, right? And he says, you know, Ayo, where is he? Lama ze azaftan et haish, why did you leave him there? Now remember, he's just chased off a marauding bunch of guys and you left him alone? Like, that's probably not the safest place for him to be, unarmed. Okay, Krenalo, go call him. Vayochal lechem, and let him at least eat bread. Vayoel Moshe, and Moshe began Lashevet et Haish, and he began to stay with Yitro, as opposed to, you know, again, Lavan, for whom Yaakov is free labor. Moshe is something very different. I'm just going to finish up, because then I have to run and put on another hat. Literally, at Yoel et Haish, Vayitin et Tzipora bito Moshe, and he gives willingly, he gives his daughter to Moshe. So it's on the one hand, it's very interesting that it's very parallel and very similar, and yet it's very different. And then we know from the story of Tzipora, one of the, I think, weirdest stories in the whole Chumash is the story with the snake and the circumcision. But either way, Tzipora saves Moshe's life. So it's in a way, it's again more of that kind of Abraham, Sarah type of balance of equality, and we can talk more about that, because unfortunately, when you have a full-time job as a prophet and as a national leader, it's kind of hard to be a father and husband. As they always say, you can do it all, but you cannot do it all at once. Okay. Next week we'll start looking at children and siblings and things like that. And thank you very much.
Thank you.